There's a kind of silence that cuts deeper than any word. It's not loud. It doesn't slam doors or shout insults. It simply leaves you out. You message them, no reply. You call, it rings and rings and rings. You show up with love in your hands, but they barely look up. And slowly, without even realizing it, you go from being the center of their world to an afterthought in their schedule. If you've ever felt that sting, if you've ever asked yourself, what did I do wrong? This video is for you. But I won't offer you false comfort, and I won't tell you they'll change tomorrow. Instead, we'll take a harder, wiser path, the Stoic path. A path that doesn't wait for apologies. A path that doesn't need validation to live with dignity. A path where silence becomes your power, and your peace is no longer held hostage by someone else's attention. So stay with me until the end, because I'll share the one shift that turns emotional pain into personal transformation. And if this speaks to something deep inside you, I invite you to subscribe to The Silent Thinker, not just to follow a channel, but to join a quiet revolution of strength, self-respect, and stoic clarity in a noisy world. Your story isn't over. In fact, it may be just beginning. Let's begin. Part 1. The Quiet Shift. From Longing to Strength. There's a quiet kind of heartbreak that creeps into the life of many parents. A grief that doesn't come from funerals or final goodbyes, but from the silence of being slowly forgotten by the very children you once centered your world around. They don't slam doors or scream rebellion anymore. They simply stop replying. They scroll past your messages, cancel visits without explanation, and make you feel like a relic from a life they've outgrown. And it hurts not because you crave control, but because you gave everything, your time, your health, your dreams, your younger years, all poured into shaping their future. But now, in the stillness of your days, there's this lingering question, what did I do to deserve this distance? Here's the brutal truth, maybe nothing. Maybe in trying to be everything, you became invisible. The world rarely teaches children to value what's always there, always giving, always forgiving. And in that cycle of availability, we unknowingly teach them to take us for granted. But this is where the Stoic path begins, not in guilt, not in regret, but in clarity. The Stoics believed in placing energy only where it mattered. They didn't chase validation. They didn't demand affection. They stood firm in self-respect. And now, it's your turn. You don't need to beg for recognition or react with tears or anger. That only reinforces the illusion that your worth is tied to their approval. Instead, live as someone who knows their value regardless of who notices. I once knew a man in his 70s who finally stopped texting his daughter first. He didn't announce it. He didn't scold. He simply started painting, hiking, and sharing laughter with strangers who became friends. Months passed, and without a single request, his daughter returned not because he pulled her back, but because his silence was no longer the silence of pain. It was the silence of someone thriving. That's the quiet power you must reclaim. You are not just a parent waiting to be needed. You are a human being who still has years to live deeply, with or without their attention. Start now, not with confrontation, but with presence. Because when you stop orbiting their world and start building your own, you shift the balance. And one day, they'll look back not out of guilt, but out of awe, and realize you never needed their approval to shine. Part 2. Emotional independence, reclaiming your peace when they no longer call. It's one thing to be ignored, it's another to hand over your emotional well-being to the person doing the ignoring. And that's exactly what happens when we keep waiting, hoping, aching for a message that never comes. We don't just suffer the silence, we become defined by it. You wake up wondering if today they'll call. You stare at your phone during dinner, check your notifications before bed, all in the quiet hope that maybe this time they'll remember. But each time they don't, a little part of you sinks deeper into self-doubt. And here's where the true danger lies when you let someone else's behavior control your inner weather. This, the Stoics would tell you, is the root of all unnecessary suffering, not what happens to us, but our belief that we need it to be different in order to be okay. You may think, but it's my child, I'm supposed to care. And yes, love is real, but dependency is not love. It's a chain. And often, it's one we forged ourselves link by link through years of attaching our identity to being needed, being wanted, being remembered. But when we build our self-worth on someone else's attention, we give them a power they never asked for and that we should never have surrendered. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." So ask yourself, honestly, have you placed the keys to your peace in the hands of someone who doesn't even know they're holding them? I've seen too many strong people shrink under the weight of waiting, mothers who break down because their grown sons forgot a birthday, fathers who lose sleep over unanswered texts, grandparents who sit in silence, surrounded by pictures of children who no longer visit. But what if the problem isn't their silence, but your expectation of sound? What if, instead of waiting to be included, you created a life so vibrant, so full, that their absence becomes just another detail, not a defining wound? Here's something personal I'll share. A woman I once met in a Stoic retreat in Oregon told me the moment everything changed for her, it was the day she stopped hoping for the phone to ring. She didn't stop loving her kids. She didn't cut them off. She just stopped depending on them. Instead, she picked up a camera. She started taking long walks alone, capturing beauty in the mundane. Her days were still quiet, but now they were hers. And wouldn't you know it, a year later, one of her sons visited out of the blue. "Mom," he said, "you look different. You seem happy." And she smiled not out of triumph, but out of truth. She was. Not because he came back, but because she had already come back to herself. This is the Stoic path, not to stop loving others, but to stop needing them to fill the parts of you that you can strengthen yourself. Love them, miss them, but don't be ruled by them. Your peace is your responsibility. And the moment you remember that, you begin to walk not in loneliness, but in freedom. That's when everything starts to shift, not outside, but within. Part 3. Silent Strength. How to command respect without saying a word. There comes a moment after the tears have dried, after the texts have gone unanswered, when words simply lose their weight. You've said all you can. You've asked, reminded, pleaded, and nothing has changed. That's when it's time to embrace something far more powerful than any speech strategic silence. The kind of silence not born from surrender, but from sovereignty. This is where the Stoic begins to separate from the desperate. Because while the desperate keep chasing, the Stoic begins to stand still, and by doing so, becomes unshakable. We live in a world where reactions are instant and constant. Someone offends us, we fire back. Someone ignores us, we try harder. We're conditioned to believe that visibility equals value, that making noise proves our presence. But the wisest among us know better. There is a type of presence so grounded, so calm, that it commands attention precisely because it does not demand it. This is the art of dignified detachment, an emotional martial art the Stoics mastered. Let me put it like this: when someone ignores you and you react with hurt or anger, you're confirming that they still have control. But when you respond with unshakable calm, when you continue your life, speak less, and live more, they begin to notice. Not because you force them to, but because human nature is drawn to what cannot be easily moved. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you shift the dynamic. Think of it like this: a king is used to people bowing before him. He expects obedience, attention, but then one day, someone who always bowed suddenly stops showing up. They don't send a message, don't explain, don't make a scene. They simply vanish with dignity. The king doesn't get angry, he gets curious. He starts to wonder what happened. And curiosity, in the Stoic framework, is the first crack in the illusion of control. I once worked with a retired teacher who told me the most powerful thing she ever did was say nothing. Her adult son had become dismissive, cold, only calling when he needed money. For years, she tried to fix it: gentle talks, invitations, guilt-tripped holidays. Nothing worked. Then one day, she stopped. She stopped reaching out. She stopped offering. She simply lived. She read more, walked more, found a group of women her age who shared her love of classical music. Months went by, no word from him, and then one morning, a letter arrived, no request, just, "Mom, are you okay?" That letter wasn't triggered by pressure, but by presence, a presence that had quietly withdrawn, leaving behind not noise but space. And space, when held with dignity, is irresistible. Stoicism teaches us this: the world does not respect desperation, but it does respect discipline. So when your children treat you as if your value has expired, don't remind them of who you were, show them who you've become, not by performing, but by standing rooted in your own worth. Say less, do more. Smile when you feel like crying, not out of denial, but out of devotion to your own peace. Let them wonder why you're not chasing anymore. Let them sit with the absence they once ignored. Because sometimes the loudest message is the one wrapped in silence. And let me be clear, this isn't about manipulation. This isn't a trick. It only works if it's real. You can't fake detachment. You can't pretend you moved on while secretly checking your phone every 10 minutes. This path requires truth, inner strength, practice. But once you walk it, once you truly let go of the need to be seen, you'll start to be seen differently. Because nothing is more attractive, more powerful than someone who is content in their own presence. So don't wait for respect. Don't beg for it. Become it. And when you do, the world, including those who once dismissed you, will have no choice but to pause. Because your silence will speak the one truth they can't ignore. You didn't need them to become whole. You just needed to remember you already were. Part 4. Letting go of guilt. You were never meant to be perfect. If there's one thing that quietly destroys more parents than silence or rejection, it's guilt. Not the sharp kind that stings in the moment, but the slow, heavy kind that settles in your bones, the kind that whispers late at night, "Maybe it's my fault." That voice, that creeping doubt will keep you frozen long after the disrespect has happened, and if you let it, it will convince you that you somehow deserve to be ignored. But here's the truth. You were never meant to be perfect. That's not a weakness. That's not an excuse. That's reality. You raised your kids with what you had, the tools you were given, the energy you could muster, and maybe you made mistakes. Maybe you yelled when you should have listened. Maybe you worked too much. Maybe you stayed silent when you should have drawn the line. But you also showed up. You fed them. You stood by them. You gave them years of your life, and now one cold shoulder is rewriting the whole story. No, that's not how this works. Guilt is a liar, a shapeshifter. It disguises itself as love, as responsibility, as humility. But more often than not, it's just a leash one you put around your own neck. And the longer you wear it, the more others learn to tug on it. They'll say, "You never really supported me," or "You were too strict," or worse, they'll say nothing at all and let your imagination do all the punishing. But here's what the Stoics understood better than anyone. You can't be tortured by a past that you've chosen to release. The past isn't happening anymore. Only your thoughts about it are. I once sat across from a man in his 60s, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. He said his daughter hadn't spoken to him in 4 years. "I think it's because I missed a few piano recitals," he told me, almost in a whisper. A few recitals? Out of 2 decades of fatherhood, this man had worked 2 jobs, paid for college, took her camping every summer. But those missed recitals had become the cornerstone of his guilt, and that guilt had stolen his spirit more than her silence ever could. Listen carefully. Guilt is not proof of love. Love is forward-moving. It's active. Guilt is backward-facing. It's stagnant. If you made mistakes, acknowledge them. If you owe an apology, offer it. But after that, you let it go. You don't keep carrying a debt that's already been paid. Your children are adults now. If they're still holding on to your mistakes, that says more about them than it does about you. Emotional maturity means understanding that our parents were people, not gods, not villains people. And if they can't see your humanity, you don't need to keep proving it. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That couldn't be more true here. The punishment you think you're enduring may not even exist outside your own mind. And the moment you free yourself from that imagined trial, you begin to stand tall again, not in arrogance, but in truth. You're not abandoning them by moving on. You're not selfish for refusing to carry guilt that doesn't serve anyone. What you're doing is stepping back into your life with dignity, with clarity, with self-respect. And in doing so, you model something powerful. You teach them what it looks like to forgive yourself and keep walking. So, from this moment forward, I want you to repeat one thing. Whenever that voice of guilt shows up, I did my best with what I knew. That is enough. And when you believe that, truly believe it, No one will ever be able to use your past to control your future again. Part 5. The power of no setting boundaries without fear or guilt. There's a moment in every parent's life when love must evolve from sacrifice into self-respect. It's the moment when you stop saying yes to preserve peace and start saying no to preserve yourself. For years, maybe even decades, you've given. You've said yes to babysitting when you were exhausted. Yes to lending money you knew would never come back. Yes to last-minute favors, forgotten birthdays, and one-sided conversations. And each time, you told yourself, this is what parents do. But is it? Or is it what guilt taught you to do? There's a hard truth here, one I'm not going to sugarcoat every time you say yes when you want to say no. You teach people that your time, energy, and emotional space are negotiable. You train them to see you not as a person, but as a resource. And when a resource dries up or refuses to bend, it gets discarded. Not because you're unloved, but because the pattern you allowed has finally broken. That's why setting boundaries isn't just necessary, it's sacred. The Stoics believed in internal order before external approval. They believed that a person who can't govern themselves will be governed by everyone else. And that's what happens when you live without boundaries. Your life becomes a democracy where everyone gets a vote, except you. You're not being cruel by saying no. You're being clear. You're not rejecting your children. You're respecting your own limits. Saying no isn't a punishment. It's a declaration that you finally recognize your time as valuable. And if that's uncomfortable for them, good. Let it be. Growth always begins at the edge of comfort. I once knew a grandmother in her 70s who was practically raising her daughter's children. She loved those grandkids, no doubt, but she hadn't been on a vacation in 12 years. Her knees hurt, her back ached, but still, every weekend she was on duty until one day her doctor said, "You need rest." And instead of asking her daughter to make other plans, she simply said, "No, not this time." It was the hardest word she'd ever said, but also the most liberating. Her daughter was upset, but the sky didn't fall. The world didn't end. And slowly, a new kind of respect began to grow not just in her daughter, but in herself. Because here's the truth. You don't teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. You teach them by what you refuse to accept. If you keep bending, they'll keep expecting it. If you keep saying yes out of fear, they'll leave. They'll stay, but out of convenience, not care. Boundaries are not walls. They're doors. Doors that say, "You're welcome here," but only if you respect the space. And if someone refuses to honor that space, they don't deserve unlimited access to your life. The next time you're asked for something that drains you, pause. Ask yourself, is this something I want to give or something I'm afraid to withhold? If the answer is fear, the answer should be no. Because every time you say no without guilt, you're reclaiming a piece of yourself. And over time, those pieces come back together to form something you thought you lost dignity. So don't be afraid of the silence that might come after a no. That silence is your soul exhaling. That silence is you stepping into the life you were always meant to live, not as a servant to others' comfort, but as the guardian of your own peace. Part 6. You are not the center anymore, and that's your freedom. There's a painful truth most parents wrestle with, but few dare to say out loud, you're not the center of their world anymore. One day, you were their everything, their provider, protector, and guide. And now, you're a background notification, a name on the calendar they might forget. The hardest part isn't just being left out, it's realizing that life is still moving for them, just not with you in it. And if you're not careful, that realization can pull you into a dark place of resentment, nostalgia, and quiet suffering. But let me offer you a radical reframe. You not being the center anymore is not a curse, it's your liberation. For so long, your identity has been wrapped around their needs. You measured your days by how well you supported them, how often they called, how close they stayed. But now, the circle has widened and you've been gently pushed to the outer edge. And yes, that hurts. But it also opens a space for you. Because here's what the Stoics would say, a life centered around others is not a stable life. It's a house built on shifting sand, where every decision is filtered through someone else's reaction. And the moment those people change or disappear, you're left without a compass. The solution isn't to demand your place back. It's to build a new center, a solid one that isn't tied to their schedule, their affection, or their recognition. It's time to rediscover your life not as a parent, but as a person. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a day that doesn't begin with waiting. Imagine not checking your phone for messages that never arrive. Imagine filling your hours with something that feeds you, a walk in the woods, a good book, a new hobby, even a quiet meal shared with someone who values your presence. And before you say, it's too late, let me remind you, it's not. If you're breathing, it's not too late. I've seen people in their 70s pick up painting, start writing poetry, even begin dating again, not to fill a void, but to live fully, not to replace what was lost, but to reclaim what was left untouched for too long. One man I met had been estranged from his kids for nearly a decade. No calls, no visits. He spent years grieving what was gone. But eventually, he realized the silence wasn't punishment, it was permission. Permission to stop waiting. He took up gardening, then joined a small group of fellow retirees who met weekly for chess and coffee. He told me, I spent 10 years dying a little every day. Now I wake up wondering what the garden looks like after last night's rain. That's the power of building a life for yourself. Because when you stop orbiting their world, they begin to wonder what world you've built. And curiosity, when it's no longer fed by guilt or pressure, has a way of pulling people back, not because you need them, but because you don't. So stop postponing joy while you wait for them to remember. Don't let your best years be spent in limbo. Create memories that are yours alone. Fill your space with things that matter to you, and when they come back, and many eventually do, let it be a reunion, not a rescue, because by then, you won't need saving. You'll already be whole. This is your time now, not to beg, not to chase, but to live. Part 7. Success in Silence. The quiet revenge they never see coming. There's a form of revenge that doesn't require confrontation, loud declarations, or emotional battles. It doesn't rely on cutting people off or making them feel guilty. It doesn't burn bridges or demand recognition. It's quiet, elegant, almost invisible at first, but it is, without a doubt, the most powerful response to being overlooked, disrespected, or forgotten. It's the silent revenge of living well. When someone pushes you to the margins of their life, the temptation is to pull them back to argue, plead, or remind them of your value. But the Stoics teach us to take a different route. Instead of chasing, we build. Instead of shouting, we grow. We stop being a character in their story and start writing our own. You don't need to slam doors or post cryptic messages. You don't need to guilt trip anyone into caring. What you need is to quietly rise, to make your absence felt not through anger, but through transformation. Because here's the secret most people don't understand when you stop waiting and start thriving. The people who took you for granted feel it deeply. They may not say it out loud, but something shifts. The dynamic tilts. The energy changes. Suddenly, your silence has weight. Your distance has meaning. And your success, especially the kind they didn't expect, becomes undeniable. I remember a woman I once coached, divorced, ignored by her children, left feeling invisible. For years, she had played the role of emotional caretaker, always available, always forgiving. And then she stopped. She didn't burn the family photo albums. She didn't block anyone on her phone. She simply changed direction. She started writing a memoir not to publish, just to process. She joined a hiking group. She cut her hair short, traveled solo for the first time in her life, and smiled more. And wouldn't you know it, the same daughter who hadn't called in 2 years reached out. "Mom, are you okay? You seem different." She was, not because her daughter came back, but because she did. That's the essence of silent success. It's not about showing off. It's about showing up for yourself. Every time you do something nourishing, challenging, beautiful, without needing anyone's approval, you heal. And as you heal, you become magnetic in a way desperation never could. The Stoics knew this well. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike those who wronged you." So if they've ignored you, don't ignore them back. That's easy. That's petty. Instead, be unlike them. Be stable. Be generous. Be joyful. Not for their benefit, but for yours. Because the real reward isn't proving them wrong, it's remembering who you are. It's feeling peace again when you wake up in the morning. It's going to bed knowing you lived the day on your terms. It's walking past the phone without checking if they finally reached out and realizing you didn't even think to look. Let them wonder where your sadness went. Let them feel the absence they created. And when they return, and many do, they won't be coming back to the same person they left behind. They'll be coming back to someone stronger, fuller, and freer. And if they don't come back, you'll be too busy living a beautiful, honest life to notice. Part 8. No more waiting. Live before time decides for you. There comes a time when you realize waiting is a decision, and it's almost never a good one. You've waited long enough. Waited for them to call, to come around, to say sorry. Waited for change, for clarity, for closure. But nothing changes. Not because they're cruel, but because they don't feel the urgency you do. And why would they? You've always been there, holding space, holding hope, holding your breath. But while you wait, something else is happening. Time is moving, The seasons turn, the days pass, and whether they come back or not, whether they ever see your worth or not, your time is being spent right now. And that's the most sobering Stoic truth of all. Your life isn't guaranteed more time, it's only guaranteed this moment. So the question is simple, but brutal. How much of your life are you willing to sacrifice to a silence that may never break? The Stoics believed in one core principle above all, memento mori. Remember, you must die. That's not morbid. It's grounding. It's freedom, because once you accept the limits of your time, you stop waiting for perfect conditions. You stop holding back for someone else to change. You act. You reclaim your life with urgency, not hesitation. And yes, when you make that decision, when you finally say, no more waiting, you'll face resistance, but not from them, from yourself. You'll feel it in your chest, the pull to check your phone just in case, the urge to replay old conversations, the whispers that say, what if they need me tomorrow? That resistance isn't weakness. It's the habit of emotional dependency trying to survive. It's the story you've lived in for so long, trying to write its final chapter, but now you're the author. You decide what happens next. Let's name the lies that try to hold you back. It's too late for me. I don't want to be alone. I'm too tired to start again. Maybe I deserve this. No, you don't. None of that is true. What's true is that the time you have left, no matter how much, is yours. And it deserves to be spent on joy, peace, discovery, and dignity, not regret. I've seen 80-year-olds take up painting, 60-year-olds fall in love again, 70-year-olds hike mountains, not to prove anything to anyone, but to reclaim the parts of themselves they left behind while waiting on someone else's timeline, and you can do the same. Your energy may not be what it once was. Your knees may ache. Your circle may be smaller, but your soul is still yours. And every breath you take is another opportunity to live, not just exist. So let me ask you, will you keep staring at the closed door? Or will you turn around and see the dozens of open ones behind you? You don't need permission. You don't need an apology. You need one thing, a decision. Today is that day. Get up, go for a walk, call someone new, learn something, build something, laugh, make your own meaning, and do it without needing anyone to validate your choice. Because at the end of your life, you won't regret who didn't call. You'll regret the moments you didn't claim while you still had the chance. So take it now. No more waiting, no more silence, no more shrinking. You are not broken, you are becoming, and they may never come back. But you've already returned. To yourself, to life, to freedom.